So we've gained 3 facts in our debate with Deconverted Man. The fact number 1, that Jesus died on the cross. Fact number 2, that Jesus was buried and the tomb became empty. Fact number 3, that the early church believed in a resurrection. I'd like to put another fact here, that Jesus claimed to be God. If we look at John chapter 2 and verse 19, Jesus said, "And Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rise it up." In the New Testament, we have many allusions to Jesus claiming the attributes that God had and the character of God had. For example, we see that Jesus takes the Passover, which was something to commemorate what God did, and Jesus is making the Passover for himself. Here we have the temple, which was where God was worshipped, and Jesus is now saying, I am the temple. So we get these allusions to Jesus pointing to his own godhood as we look at the Jewish context. If you want to look into detail here, a number of scholars in Jerusalem who went to Jerusalem and over a 10-year period have done historical studies about this. It's on the Discovery Channel, and it's an 8-part series which I'll link to if you want to look at details. So those are our 4 facts, okay? Now, here's the questions that we need to ask. Explanatory scope. We look at the quantity of the facts that our hypotheses account. We would say that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, does our hypotheses take into the quantity of the facts? Well, our hypothesis builds on those 4 facts, okay? Now, the hypotheses of those who believe that Jesus is a myth would end up denying the resurrection, denying, number 1, Jesus died on the cross, number 2, Jesus was buried and the tomb became empty, number 3, the early church preached the resurrection, number 4, that Jesus claimed to be God. So the hypothesis that Jesus was a myth ends up denying these basic historical facts that we have. Okay? If we come at it and say, well, we don't believe in miracles, and we say that miracles can't happen in history, okay, but what is your hypothesis about these historical facts? Do you agree with them, or do you not? And if you say that there can be no miracles that happen, you've still got a problem with dealing with the 4 facts. What do you do with them? Explanatory power looks at the quality of the given facts. If you can explain your position with less ambiguity, then it has better explanatory power. So, if you say that miracles cannot happen, how does that affect the quality of your facts? Are you saying that the early church had that they were deluded, that they were seeing visions? But that would deny a historical fact that we know is a historical fact, that in 1st century Judaism they were preaching a physical resurrection. So you end up denying a historical fact by positing a hypothesis and changing information that has no historical factual base at all. Okay? Whereas our hypothesis that Christ rose from the dead fits and has good quality facts. Number 3, plausibility. The hypothesis conforms to the background knowledge better than other positions. We look at opponents' views and see also if they are confirmed by anything in history or today by the sciences. Science cannot say whether a miracle happened or not. So saying that Jesus rose from the dead does not go against science, okay? You cannot say at the quantum level, when a contingent historical event is happening at a quantum level, whether in physics, biology, whatever, you cannot say that it is not possible for a miracle to happen. because you do not know fully what goes on at the quantum level. So you always have to be open to the possibility that something can dysfunction or change your hypotheses. That's why science works on probability these days. Okay, if you want to do more research on that, read up on Hume's view of contingency and skepticism. So our hypothesis doesn't go against any scientific information. Our hypothesis is plausible because it fits the historical data. We know that Christ died, we know that it was buried and it became empty, the tomb, and we know that the early church preached a physical resurrection, and our hypothesis fits those facts. Less ad hoc, when we use less non-evidence assumptions, we are in a better position than using such arguments that lack any evidence. If you start to say that miracles can't happen and Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then you have to begin to put in information that is not verified by any historical data. So for example, you will have to say, well, that means that the body must have been stolen. Well, you've got to give you've got to give solid historical information to prove that. Or you might say that Jesus didn't really die, but he got up and he walked out and he lived. Well, you've got to give historical data and information, and you're just twisting the evidence that we already have. Illumination. Our hypothesis can provide good solutions to historical problems, and if this is the position, it strengthens one's case. Our hypothesis solves one of the big historical problems, is that the Gospels are supposed to be in a production over a long period of history, when actually the Gospels were written. The story of Jesus about his death and resurrection is actually solved by our hypotheses in terms of historical length. If you look at 1 Corinthians 15, so our hypothesis completely demolishes Bultmann scholarship, which has already been demolished anyway. But 1 Corinthians 15 says, "Now I would remind you, brothers, of the Gospels I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then he appeared to the apostles, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." This historical information was written around about 55 AD, and we know, scholars will tell you, you can read Lycona, you can read skeptical scholars as well, we know that this information goes back to about 33 AD. Alright, so this is early historical testimony about Jesus, and we know that for a fact. And if that is the case, then it completely revolutionized New Testament studies, it revolutionizes our history and understanding of Christianity. Okay, so my hypothesis is that Jesus rose from the dead, and it's based on 4 historical pincer evidences. That Jesus was crucified, that Jesus was buried and the tomb became empty, that the early church preached a physical resurrection, and Jesus said that he was the Son of God, that he was God. Okay, now if my hypothesis fits those facts, alright, then if that means that Jesus rose from the dead and he claimed to be God, then that shows there is a God. Alright, it shows that God does exist. It vindicates Jesus' ministry, it vindicates the Old Testament, it vindicates the New Testament, it vindicates Christianity. That's my position. Okay, okay, so now I just want to go into a critique of your position, Deconverted Man. So, okay, so you made 3 issues in your video. the issue of myth and a definition of what myth was, and how can we differentiate what myth is from non-myth. And you made the allusion to Hinduism. You then talked about there is no evidence for God, and then thirdly you talked about the issue of that there is no scientific evidence for miracles. Those are the three issues that you brought up. First of all, about myth. The definition of myth, we can go into the Oxford Dictionary. The Oxford Dictionary gives a number of allusions to myth. A myth is a traditional story, especially one of early history of people or explaining of natural or social phenomenon, typically involving supernatural beings or events. Ancient Celtic myths mask the heroes of Greek myths. Next, widely held but false belief or idea, the belief that evening primrose oil helps our cure Alzheimer is a myth, according to dermatologists. Next, a fictitious or imaginary person, thing. Nobody had ever heard of Simon's mysterious friend, and Anne said he was a myth. Next, an exaggeration or idealized conception of a person or thing. The book is scholarly study of the Churchill myth. Now, myth, if you look at the history of the scholars who talk about mythology, it's very complex. We could talk about, I could talk about Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, John Campbell's understanding of myth, but we'll just take for a working knowledge the Oxford Dictionary's understanding. This does not apply. This does not apply to the historical study of Jesus. The reason it does not apply is because I've made an allusion to this, to the work of Dr. Barkham and many others who have shown convincingly that the Gospels are historical. The genre is historical writing, not mythological writing. He studied Polybius, a Greek historian, and he noticed, and other scholars have noticed, that Polybius believed that good history was written by eyewitness accounts, that you get eyewitness accounts before you write your historical data, if you can. He used, for information, technical language such as apodikite, tike, which was a reference to collecting your historical data. So eyewitness material was key to historians of antiquity, right? And Polybius was widely read by ancient historians and the ancient people of Rome and Greece. And in chapter 12 of his histories he talked about doing history and getting eyewitness accounts. As we read we know when the Gospels were generally written, around about 70 to 90 AD, which was in the time of the eyewitness accounts. And we also know that Christian thinkers also believed, not so long after the Gospels, in the importance of historical eyewitness material, such as Polybius, mentioned by Eusebius, and Polycarp. Polybius uses the exact Greek technical word for gathering historical information as Polybius. Dr. Barkham has shown also that the hypothesis by the Bultmann school that says that the Gospels would happened over a long period of history in editing, a sort of mythological Christ, is incorrect, because they were not anonymous communities. Early on in the Gospels, in the early church, we read in the Gospels, for example, specific names, key names mentioned, who were custodians of the tradition. So, for example, you have James, you have Peter, you have John, and they would have been around to guide the community in the eyewitness traditions of Jesus. And so Barkham has completely demolished the Bultmann school in this area, and scholars have taken this seriously in the scholarly world, what he's written. So in other words, we're in a different category. We're looking at the Gospels as historical eyewitness material, which is completely different from myth, alright?